Hello to my wolf pack, Charlie Black 20, back again for another video on Nuremberg. So, first of all, Merry Christmas. I hope you all enjoyed your Christmas and a Happy New Year coming up very, very soon. We left off with our last video where we finished off with the defenses of the various defendants for the trial. And how they justified, deflected, evaded, denied, all those things. Now we get to the verdicts. So you see, what happened is once the prosecution and the defense rested, the judges went into relative seclusion, the 8 judges, but mainly the 4 judges, the main 4 judges, and they discussed the various evidence, and then they had to vote on whether they would convict or not. Now, the way that it would happen is you needed at least 3 votes to convict for guilty. If you did not have that, you were at an impasse, and very likely it was going to be an acquittal. Now, I won't go into all the wrangling and finagling they did do for the various defendants. I will say that in the end, it was a very, very fair decision in the end, although there are some kind of contradictions and maybe some issues of personal conviction, personal prejudice going on. Not by a huge amount, nothing that would destroy the trial overall, but maybe some of the defendants got a little bit of a raw deal based off of personality. But in the end, the very fair verdicts. So you have the 22 defendants, and of those, 19 are found guilty of various crimes, and 3 are acquitted. So, of those found guilty, 12 of them are sentenced to death by hanging. Now, Martin Bormann, who had been tried in absentia because nobody knew where he was, but there was various rumors that he was alive. It turns out in the 1970s, during excavation in Berlin, they found bodies, and through DNA, they managed to figure out that Martin Bormann had been killed or died in Berlin before the end of the war. So the death sentence had already been carried out. It is very likely that he was killed by Russian artillery when he tried to escape the city, so Bormann a coward to the end. All he was interested in was power. He had no character whatsoever based off of everything the defense and the prosecution said. He was just Hitler's secretary, and that was it. Now, for those who were sentenced to death, you had Goering, Ribbentrop, Frank, Frick, Jodl, Keitel, Kaltenbrunner, Rosenberg, Sauckel, Inquart, Streicher. All of them were found guilty of various charges, and based on the severity of their involvement, they were sentenced to hang. There were 3 that were sentenced to life in prison. Walter Funk, Erich Raeder, and Rudolf Hess. Now, I'm going to cover Hess for a second because I think the only reason they spared his life in the end was because of the idea that he wasn't completely mentally sound and he had not taken part in the various atrocities. He had been part of the planning and he had been part of the conspiracy, but he had been in jail as a prisoner of war for the last 4 years in Britain, where the worst of the atrocities had taken place. That's the only reason he was spared, really. Because the Russians, especially Stalin, wanted Rudolf Hess's head for trying to make a separate peace with Britain so they could focus on Russia. Then you had various prison terms as well for these men. You had 10 to 20 years. Donitz was sentenced to 10 years. Schirach was sentenced to 20 years. Speer was sentenced to 20 years. And Konstantin von Neurath was sentenced to 15 years. And the three acquittals, you had Schacht, von Papen, and Hans Fritzsche. They were acquitted. There was a huge argument between the judges about this in the end because they were having a hard time figuring out Schacht. And then they tried to move on to von Papen. They had a hard time with von Papen. With Hans Fritzsche, most of them agreed that this guy's low level. He seems to have been fairly conciliatory and fairly repentant about this evidence. He seems to have never even met most of these defendants. His role was minor at best. But once they figured out Fritzsche, they decided that if von Papen went free, it had to be concluded that Schacht had to go free. That they were perhaps not morally great people, but they had not become arch criminals in the way that the other Nazis had. Now, although they were acquitted and they were told immediately that, yeah, they could leave and get out, it turns out that the West German government that was being formed at the time, basically a lynch mob had formed outside the prison and was threatening to hang them all. Basically, they were trying to slip away from Nuremberg, and eventually all three of them did leave Nuremberg after a few days, but they were eventually brought into courtrooms in West Germany, found guilty of various offenses for their work under the Nazis, and sentenced to various terms of hard labor or imprisonment. Most of them were released pretty quickly because of ill health, but they did get sentenced by a West German court because not because they were arch criminals, but because they had failed as Nazis, basically. Now, at the very last minute before their executions, they had many of the defendants had gone to appeal their verdicts to the occupation government, which in this case is the Americans. And there were many of them that were asking to be shot rather than hanged. Of course, this was denied. There was the big issue of Goering for the occupation government. You see, there was one officer in particular, I believe his name was, actually, I'm sorry, I can't remember his name off the top of my head. I'm sorry. I will put his name in the description, okay? This American officer, he had the decision of whether or not to spare Goering's life or to allow him to be shot as a soldier. And in the end, he said no. Although Goering, as a World War I flying ace, had fought bravely, as the Nazi and the Reichsmarshal of Germany, he had dishonored airmen, particularly by what happened with the British airmen who had escaped custody from Stalag 50 by having them recaptured and then shot without trial. So he decided, no, Goering, I don't care about honor among airmen, he dishonored us. So Goering was continued to be sentenced to death by hanging, as well as all the others. Oddly, Erich Raeder, who had been sentenced to life in prison, asked that his conviction be upped so that he could be killed. And the occupation government said, no, you were convicted and sentenced to life in prison. We can't raise the sentence. We can only lower it or leave it as it is. So Raeder, oddly enough, would spend quite a long time in prison. The scheduled executions. The prison commandant, Andrus, he tries to keep them from figuring out when the executions are. He keeps a very watchful eye on all the defendants as they prepare the gallows in a gymnasium. But many of them figure out when the execution is going to take place. In particular, Goering. When at the 11th hour, almost literally, Goering manages to slip a cyanide capsule into his mouth, bite down on it, and commit suicide. He left several letters behind to his captors claiming why he had done this, how he had done this, and basically boasting that he had escaped the hangman's noose, because the hangman's noose was considered dishonorable for anybody to die by, particularly soldiers. This left the other 11 Nazis still sentenced to be hanged. They began with von Ribbentrop. They walked him to the gallows, handcuffed to another guard. They tied his hands behind his back with rope, put the hood over his head, and the executions began. Now, in many cases, the executions were not done correctly. It is believed that the man who did the hangings, his name was John Woods, he had volunteered to be a hangman when when American forces reached out for volunteers among their men. He volunteered because he wanted a cushy job and said that he had done hangings before. It was a lie. So when the hangings happened, either the ropes were not short enough, the knots weren't good enough, or when the sentenced went down the hole in the gallows, their heads would hit the boards on the way down, and they would start bleeding. And many of them strangled to death or had to have their necks broken by having guards go behind the curtains and pull their bodies down to break their necks. That's how Streicher died. Very, very hard. Now, maybe I'm in the minority on this, but I really don't have much sympathy for those Nazis who were hanged and their executions were botched. They suffered for a while, yes. Should they not have? Probably. The fact that they did doesn't really bother me. Even Streicher. I mean, a lot of people said, listen, why would Streicher be sentenced to death? He was just a newspaper man who wrote a lot of anti-Semitic stuff. Yeah, he was a vulgar, vile man, but he had never murdered anybody. I think that he was partly he was hanged because he was seen as very low class, as well as just a horrible human being. And that maybe he was practicing his free speech, but in reality, I think he was inciting not only hatred, but any kind of consequences towards anybody of Jewish blood, Jewish race, Jewish religion. And so whether those actions against Jewish people would have been financial, economic, spiritual, or physical, I think he was inciting towards hatred and discrimination, and most importantly, violence. So I really don't shed many tears. I shed no tears for Streicher whatsoever. He deserved what he got. Now, after the executions are done, the bodies are put on display in coffins for the press to take pictures of. Then they are taken to a nearby crematorium, some say in Dachau, and their remains were burned, taken to the Isar River, and scattered down it so that they would never have a resting place. There would be no Nazi memorials. That is the fate that befell the Nazi leadership by the end of the war in the Nuremberg trials. Now, there is an aftermath to this. You see, this was the one and only international trial. After this, the Russians, the French, the British, and the Americans, their alliance, their coalition, broke apart. The Cold War had officially begun. From then on, all trials were to be done by separate nations. And for the Nuremberg trials, they weren't quite over. There would be 12 more subsequent Nuremberg trials, as they're called, where instead of the top leadership of each section of the Nazi government and the Nazi hierarchy, they now went down the list of the hierarchies of each organization that had been found criminal or those that needed to be tried. For example, you had the judges, the doctors, several industrialists. You had a couple of trials for single individuals like Oswald Pohl and Milch, who was Goering's second in command, and actually his brother-in-law. And you also had what was the largest murder trial in history, called the Einsatzgruppen trial. And the last prosecutor to die from the Nuremberg trials was Ben Ferenz, and he died only 2 years ago at the age of 103. He had presided over that trial as the chief prosecutor against 22 defendants. He found them all. He managed to get them all convicted on different charges. And that murder trial was 1.5 million victims large. That was the Holocaust by bullets that I mentioned before. Ferenz was a great man. And if you go on Netflix, you can find a lot about him, as well as YouTube. You can find him giving interviews and lectures. He was only 27 when he tried those Nazis. But with this going on, the problem is that these subsequent Nuremberg trials, they ended in 1949, and then there was a change in tone for the Allies, particularly in America, because now the big enemy was the Soviet Union and communism. So Nazi crimes and Nazi criminality was not to be forgotten, but to be pushed back, to be on the back burner, to be, how shall we say, that it was time to move ahead with new priorities, and catching Nazi criminals wasn't a priority anymore, politically speaking. So by 1956, with the new West German government having been formed and the American occupation forces basically leaving, nobody who had been tried in Nuremberg or the subsequent trials, none of them were left in prison. Many death sentences had been commuted. Many had been pardoned, released, some for medical reasons, some for political reasons. Again, by 1956, less than 9 years after the verdicts. Still, these trials revealed the broad criminality of the Nazi government, the broad atrocities done by everybody involved with the Third Reich and its allies. And it was a great step in international law. It helped with the UN Charter in many ways. It helped to solidify the idea that this was a war that had to be fought, and that the racism and discrimination that happened because of these Nazis needed to be attacked head on, needed to be publicized, needed to be recorded. If there had just been summary executions, none of this information would have come out for decades. This was needed, and it was a great step forward, even if political will did die out after a while. But in 1998, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and several ad hoc international trials for the atrocities in Rwanda, Somalia, Bosnia. In 1998, the International Criminal Court was ratified in Rome, and in 2002, the ICC was opened officially. So that's where Nuremberg led us. I hope you guys enjoyed this series. I know it was quite long, and I probably kept talking and talking and talking as usual, but I felt this was a very important series to do. So thank you guys for listening, and take care, my wolf pack.